Stephen Brush is Professor Emeritus of the History of Science at the University of Maryland College Park. He was originally educated as a theoretical physicist and did research on topics such as the solidification of electron gas at low temperatures and high densities. He contributed to Harvard Project Physics course for high schools using an historical approach. He came to the University of Maryland in 1968 to initiate a program in history of science. His current research is about why scientists in different fields accept or reject new theories. Dr. Brush.
Well, let me say, first of all, I'm delighted to be here with this group, and I would like to be sure that everybody can hear me and also understand me. So in the absence of artificial amplification, I will try to speak loudly and clearly, but anybody who can't hear me, please put up your hand or scream or something, and I will try to do better. Also, I do not particularly like to talk continuously for an hour and have everybody suppress their questions until the end. I would very much prefer to have discussion as we go along, so please don't hesitate if anything I say is not clear or you want to ask a question. I don't mind having questions interrupting me during the lecture, okay? Here is the outline of the talk, which I will be giving, and as you can see, this is, on the one hand, starts off with a threefold division of three parties: postmodernism, science, and fundamentalism, arrayed appropriately from left to right. And then I'm going to talk primarily, however, about the postmodernism part, and in particular about the part that affects me in my profession as a historian of science, which is the claim that science is socially constructed. So there's a social construction movement, which is basically one component of what is known as postmodernism. And that's what I'll talk about primarily, but just a very few brief remarks about the creation-evolution controversy as an example of the fundamentalist attack on science. I'm not going to have too much.
When you talk to the wall, we can't hear you.
What?
When you talk to the wall, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll try to do that again.
We heard it enough.
Okay. I suppose I should just look forward at this thing on this plate. That would be better. And also, there are some seats, some chairs back there if anybody wants to sit down. Okay. I'm going to talk primarily about social construction, but just a very few brief words about fundamentalism and the creationist movement, which I expect you are all fairly familiar with already, whereas social construction is a much more limited academic type of movement. Okay. Now, just to review, the fundamentalists attack science from the right, as it were, and what are the consequences of this as far as science is concerned? Well, first of all, they are primarily concerned to drive evolution out of public school science courses. Having failed to do that directly as a result of various court decisions which say you cannot exclude scientific discussions just because it happens to offend your own religious beliefs, they have taken the tactic of talking about creationism as an alternative to evolution and trying to get schools to teach creationism, or as it is now called, intelligent design, and somehow give equal time to that. Now, of course, this has indirectly the same effect, either that the time that you give intelligent design, of course, has to be taken away from talking about real science, but also because of the idea of being a controversy in many communities, they hope, and I think this turns out to be the case, that science teachers will decide they don't want to take the heat from the locals who are creationists, and therefore it's easier for the science teacher just not to talk about evolution at all, then they don't have to talk about creationism. So this is one way in which they have achieved their goal. I have been particularly interested, having a background in physics, in trying to persuade my colleagues in physics and the physical sciences that this is something that affects them. It doesn't just affect the biologists who are interested in teaching evolution, but if you look at the creationist literature, you find that not only do they reject evolution, but they also, because they believe that the entire universe and the earth were created only 10,000 years ago, they are also rejecting large parts of modern astronomy, large parts of geology, indirectly rejecting parts of physics, because physics is used to determine the radioactive dating, radiometric dating of rocks, and thereby get the age of the Earth to be 4.5 billion years, contrary to the 10,000-year creationist timescale. So if you look at how they try to justify their very short young Earth, you find that they basically have to reject the principles of modern 20th century physics at the same time. So it does affect science as a whole. It's not just a problem for biologists, and having a background in physics, I've tried to convince my colleagues that they need to pay attention to this and not just let the subjects like the expanding universe and plate tectonics and so forth be wiped out of high school science courses, or if they're there, somehow matched up against the creationist alternative to those. Okay, I think there are a number of cases in which it is important for the public to understand evolution, in particular to understand natural selection, and one which is currently of considerable interest is the fact that bacteria can evolve by selection and become immune to antibiotics. There was a long article in the Post just a few weeks ago about antimicrobial soaps, which many people use, which kill the bacteria, except they kill all the ones except a few which happen to be immune to the soap, and then those are the ones that take over in the next generation. And so we are in a situation where various antibiotic medicines, starting with penicillin, have become essentially useless because the bacteria that they kill have evolved by natural selection to be immune to them. So this is a very serious public health problem, the overuse of antibiotics in medicine, the overuse of antimicrobial soaps to wash your hands. Okay. Unfortunately, the Post article, which called attention to this very long article, never mentioned the word evolution as the reason for this. And I think that it's important for people to realize that this is an example of evolution. Okay. Also, another interesting side effect of fundamentalism, which is not directly related to creationism, but often the same people are involved, is when you talk about global warming. Apparently there is a split in the evangelical community, and one fairly strong faction has taken the viewpoint that we don't need to worry about global warming because, after all, it's something which won't happen for another, won't be, seriously affect us for another century or two, and by that time the end times will have come, and we'll all be going up to heaven or hell or whatever. So why bother about something as trivial as global warming? Unfortunately, there's another evangelical group which has taken the opposite point of view and has argued that it is our duty as Christians to take good care of the earth. And finally, the fundamentalist view or creationist view is also behind the bans on certain types of research on stem cells, for example, which could be very important in medicine. Okay, so that's simply a sketch of that subject, which I'm not going to have much else to say about. Now, I believe in your newsletter you got, your attention was called to this article in the paper about the Pope being shouted down or prevented from speaking because the scientists in Italy argued that the Pope was anti-science on the basis of a speech that he had given in 1990 when he was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. In the speech, he quoted the Austrian philosopher Paul Feyerabend as saying, "The Church at the time was much more faithful to reason than Galileo himself," and also took into consideration ethical and social consequences and so forth. Well, this, I think, is a good example of how the two ends of the spectrum, the fundamentalists on the right and the postmodernists on the left, join hands to attack science, which is in the middle. Because here we have Feyerabend, a philosopher who I would categorize as a postmodernist, although not a social constructivist, basically supporting the fundamentalist view on science and saying Galileo was wrong, the Church was right. Well, I, having read a lot of the works of Feyerabend, you want, yes?
You're blocking your own slide. Yeah.
For somebody, for you.
No, for everyone.
You're casting a shadow, sir.
You were casting a shadow on it.
Okay. Try to find the ideal position to stand. Okay. So the question is, where did he get this quote from? I went through several books of Feyerabend to see where he actually said this, and what I found, I could not find those exact words. However, the first sentence of it about the Church was more faithful to reason is in fact Feyerabend's position, but this is a great example of a quote being taken out of context, because whoever dug up this quote didn't read the rest of the book or the rest of the chapter, because Feyerabend's whole point was that sometimes science does not advance by reason. Sometimes, in the case of Galileo, he was saying, Galileo could not support the Copernican system by appeal to the laws of nature as they were accepted at that time. In other words, by reason. Basically, he had to realize by his own intuition about what the world was like, that the laws of nature that were accepted, that is the Aristotelian laws, were simply wrong. And he had to basically ditch them and eventually propose new laws of nature that would be compatible with the Copernican heliocentric system. But Feyerabend's whole point is that you can't simply rely on any particular method in science, in particular the use of logical reasoning, may work sometimes, but not other times. You may have to resort to rhetoric, you may have to resort to intuition or tricks or whatever. And in fact, the motto of Feyerabend, as quoted by many people, is anything goes in science, whatever method you can use to get to the right answer. And the point of Feyerabend's argument is that ultimately Galileo was successful and the Church was not. Eventually Galileo ended up with the right answer. So it is not a criticism of Galileo to say he wasn't faithful to the laws of reason. And therefore the meaning of this quotation has been completely twisted. The most successful scientific inquiries don't go by a rational method. Sometimes you just have to throw out reason and rationality to get the right answer. Now, that's a very postmodernist point of view. And not very many people in science would actually agree with him, but nevertheless, that is his position. Okay, now the topic I'm going to talk about mainly is social constructionism as a way of interpreting science. And what are the reasons? Why should we be concerned about social constructionism? I think it's probably something that people, unless you happen to be in my field or in the field of what we call science studies or sociology of science or history of science, you may have never actually heard of the phrase social constructionism. I don't know to what extent it's, how many people have heard of social constructionism? Okay, more than I expect, about half. Good, okay, then you have some idea what I'm talking about. Okay, why should scientists be concerned about social constructionism? Well, basically because it is an approach which argues that scientists do not discover reality, they make it up. Okay, that they are not looking at the world, investigating the world to find out what is true about nature, but rather by some kind of social process which involves their own self-promotion, involves rhetoric, whatever, they create scientific knowledge rather than discover it. And this is, in a sense, a very direct attack on the credibility of science, to say that scientists are not finding out what's true about the world, they're just making it up. And so this, of course, makes it easier for things like fraud or superstition or astrology or all kinds of anti or unscientific approaches to flourish, because, you know, we get basically giving equal credibility to these. And I notice, I'm very pleased to see that you're honoring Bob Park, my colleague at the University of Maryland, who has done quite a lot as a physicist to expose the fallacies of many of these movements that are trying to replace science. Okay, I've just been reading about a new TV series, Eli Stone. Has anybody seen this? I didn't have a chance to watch the first. What was your impression of it? Did you find that it was trying to promote mysticism or what?
Yes.
Okay, that's, anyway, apparently, according to the description, it was something which was promoting paranormal and mystical explanations for things. But in general, anything which undermines the credibility of science, if people take it seriously, let's say if a congressman or a president or a director of the National Science Foundation were to take seriously the ideas of social constructionism, they would say, well, why are we giving the scientists all this money to do their research if they're not actually finding out true facts about the world? They're just making it up. So I think if it were taken seriously, it would threaten the credibility and therefore the funding for scientific research. If a scientist were to take it seriously, then he or she would perhaps not have a strong motivation to do research. After all, why do you do science in the first place unless you think you're finding out true facts about the world? So this is the type of threat that it has. Now, I think in the broader scale of things, I think the threat to science from social constructionism and postmodernism is really much less than the threat from fundamentalism and creationism. So, and as I will try to show in this lecture, social constructionism and postmodernism are actually fads or movements which have already begun to disappear. They lasted for maybe a generation, maybe 25 years or so, but they sort of ran through their natural cycle, and we're now on to some other movement which has yet to acquire an accepted name, whereas fundamentalism and creationism is here to stay, as far as I can see, at least in the United States, and it's not something that's going to go away, and it's something which attracts a much bigger following in the general public, so it is really much more of a threat. So let's start with Paul Feyerabend, since he's been quoted here. As I said, Paul Feyerabend is clearly a postmodernist, but he's not social constructionist, what he advocates is what he calls democratic relativism, which means that everybody's beliefs are of equal value. So that this, which in practice means that he's perfectly willing to have the creationists given equal credibility, equal resources as the scientists. He's regarding these as simply different traditions which people happen to follow. And as long as one tradition doesn't impose its views on another, then everybody should live together and be happy. And what he argues then is that you should have the course of scientific research, including the funding of research and what problems should be approached, decided democratically by a vote of citizens. No requirement that they know anything about science. And therefore, this would be, I think he is perfectly happy with the idea that in a particular community or state or country where you have a majority of people who are evangelical fundamentalists, and if they want to vote against funding any research in science, evolution or whatever, then that's their decision and nobody can contest it. Everybody judges by their own tradition. So he talks about some citizens in California have used state laws to introduce Genesis into biology textbooks and to remove passages about evolution. He seems to be perfectly happy with that. That's democracy. Yes?
I was thinking that a few years ago, Congress passed a law that, or funding to the NIH, saying they had to study alternative medicine.
Yes.
Is that still going on?
Yes. Yeah. Now, that is a case where the scientists, as it turns out, have actually had some influence on the implementation. And in fact, we have a center at the University of Maryland Medical School in Baltimore set up with federal funding from this law to study alternative medicine. And what they are doing is to take let's say a traditional Chinese technique like acupuncture and try it out, do experiments to see if it actually works, if you can actually have in this case, a randomized control group of people who get, one group gets the therapy, the other gets the sham or something. And so this is, I think, something which is a good way to approach this, is to say, okay, somebody thinks this works, let's try it out, let's test it by the same methods that we use for testing any other type of therapy or medicine, by having a controlled experiment with a randomized group and so forth, and measure quantitatively what the effects are. Of course, that's not the way most people operate, and it takes a lot of money to undertake something like this. But so this is one way, I think, a reasonable way to approach this whole thing. Say, if people think this works, let's test it and really see if it does. Okay. Yes.
Just as a note, somebody decided to try the same sort of tactic with prayer. And they developed a scientific, controlled, double-blind, whatever study for prayer.
Right.
So that sort of thought pattern has been approached in a couple of different ways.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very interesting case, and I've studied that historically.
As far as I know, it didn't involve any federal funding. Praise be to God.
Right. That's right. That was actually proposed back around 1870 by a scientist, that, if you guys believe that prayer works, why don't you submit it to a test? And the religious people were terribly offended by this, and they thought, this is very offensive to God to somehow test his power or something like that. But this has gone back and forth for more than a century now. People have tried these experiments, and sometimes they seem to work, sometimes they don't. Yeah.
You're making the assumption here is that the scientists, my brother's a physicist, so I have some feeling for this. The scientists are ipso facto the good guys, and the lay public are ipso facto boobs. But considering the impact that science, particularly government-funded science, has is not there a reasonable right of the public representatives to have some say in research? For instance, if the Tuskegee syphilis experiments had been subject to some kind of public scrutiny, they never would have happened. And some of the radiation experiments the old AEC did never would have happened. So isn't there some legitimacy of public review in
Yes.
these sciences?
Yes, I think there is, and I think we do
Well,
have.
where do you
I
define,
think-
the limits? And how?
I think we do have public review now in Congress, for example. And I think that we do have cases where Senator, was it Dingell, I think, is the one who has done this quite a bit. I think this does get mixed up in the politics of Congress, and I think this comes back every few years. Somebody will hold a hearing and they will find some title of a research project which sounds ridiculous and publicize it. So yes, this is part of our democracy, is that this is subject to congressional review, and the scientists have to live with a certain amount of this, yes.
With the stem cell research.
Yeah, right. And I think sometimes the scientists have been more successful than other times in convincing the public or convincing the Congress that what they're doing is worthwhile to fund. So that's an ongoing dispute. Yes, I agree. Yes.
Is K.R. Fend, is he from a religious tradition? I mean, this taxes my reason to try to understand how one could come up with such nonsense. I know he's a respected philosopher.
Well, he's not a let's say he's, I think he died a few years ago. He's Austrian, and I think he's gone through various wars, and I met him once, and he was going around on crutches because of one of his legs wasn't working. But he was somebody, basically he's somebody who considers himself an anarchist. In fact, that's the title of one of his books. Basically, he's somebody who likes to make a big thing out of the fact that he's different from everybody else. He's not going to accept what anybody else tells him to do, and in particular, he's not going to, this whole book that he writes is called Against Method. He's trying to say there is no scientific method which is guaranteed to produce successful results. It's anything goes, is his slogan. In the back, yes, please.
I think you're kind of taking a little bit out of context, though, because the whole basis behind the postmodern attack on science was that back in the 1950s, whenever it started, that there's a view of science as like a godlike entity that could make no mistakes, and yet it produced the nuclear weapons and all of these atrocities. So what it started out was that they wanted to take a step back and say, you are not infallible, you are people like everybody else. You have to understand that there are two different viewpoints to everything. You need to think about the potential social consequences of what your research does. It's not saying that, that it's on the same level as fundamentalism. And even in Derrida's book, he says that you have to understand that some intellectual pursuits, even though they're fundamentally equal with others, they require more funding and more time. So in that sense, they're not, but they should be given the same respect in each one. So I think that it's not completely an attack just trying to completely destroy the institution of science, but it's trying to help it as well.
Okay, that is, I think you're quite correct, and I think a lot of people do have that feeling. And for me, the issue is, if you're going to attack science, should you understand anything about science? And what I think has turned out with the social construction movement is that many of the people were, in fact, confessed this, the fact that they were people who never liked science starting from age 10 and went off into some other field, and they resent the dominance of the scientific view in their society, just as you say, but they're not willing to learn anything about science so that their criticism can be informed. That I think is what has happened with the social constructionism. But I think in principle what you're saying is quite reasonable, that somebody would be offended by some of the effects of science, yes. Yes.
I actually attended lectures by Paul hereafter.
Yes.
Back at UC Berkeley.
Yes.
I was there for a summer. And that was when I was there, that was 1970. Actually, he was probably placed more as a liberal Democrat. And then this development in his philosophy came later. So I just say, partially in his defense, I have a soft spot for him. And he was quite an entertaining lecturer.
Yes, yes.
That this was the development, this is really like the later fire on, and there's a lot in his writing, I think, that this group
Yes.
is sympathetic.
Yeah. Okay, well, I
That
know
was
before-
prior,
Yeah.
this is 75, it's a later development in his later career.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Now, the person who is generally regarded by the social constructionists themselves as their founder, as the person that they were inspired by, is Thomas Kuhn. Now, I have to make a disclosure here that it was Thomas Kuhn who taught the course that I took in History of Science when I was an undergraduate, and he was the person who inspired me to become a historian of science, and I have maintained some contact with him throughout his life, so I'm very sympathetic to a lot of his views. But he plays a very peculiar role in the whole story, because in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he describes a revolution as being like a gestalt switch. That is, you have these classical psychological experiments where you can have a sort of an ambiguous figure. You can see it as this, or you can see it as that. So it's sort of seeing the world, saying that the same world, you suddenly see it in a different way in a scientific revolution, and he calls that a change from one paradigm to another. And he describes the process of paradigm change as being something which cannot be objectively proved, but rather the scientific community decides that they will accept the new paradigm because it does things that they want it to do. And I think he really shouldn't have used this language, because he's talking about conversion as if it's like a religious conversion. Somebody has an epiphany, they suddenly decide to become a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever, which implies that there is no rational reason for it. And he basically did not mean that. I think he's talking about a group of people who are all scientists who are using objective reasons. It's just that the balance switches from one paradigm to the other when they weigh the various factors. But it's basically, as he says, a special kind of community which is making this switch. But that is how he described it. Now, he has, of course, contributed this word paradigm to the language. And as you may know, if you've studied languages like Latin, you know that the word paradigm itself was originally just a pattern, like amo, amas, amat. If you have a certain type of verb or noun which goes through declensions or conjugations, and you give examples. So paradigm is an example. And he broadened the use of the word. He still used the word paradigm as an example of solving a particular problem, but he also enlarged it to mean a view of the world. So people now, especially inside the Beltway, talk about paradigms all the time. And unfortunately for Kuhn, he sort of disowned the word after a few years because he didn't want to keep arguing with people about what is a paradigm. Unfortunately, it became an all-purpose word for any general viewpoint which you want to accept and impose on other people without providing any objective justification for it. And this is the notorious example which came out a few years ago before Gonzalez became the Attorney General, in which he said that the new paradigm of the world makes the Geneva Convention obsolete. This is basically the justification which Gonzalez and other people in the administration use for waterboarding and things like this, the use of torture, even though they seem to violate the Geneva Convention. He's saying, oh, well, we have a new paradigm now. We don't have to worry about the Geneva Convention anymore. It's obsolete. Okay, so that's, I think, is a very unfortunate development in the use of that word. Now, another person who is regarded as the founder or an example of social construction is Paul Forman. And I think you mentioned Paul Forman as a possible speaker to this group because he's at the Smithsonian. He published this paper. He was a student of Kuhn. I met Forman several times and maintained contact with him. About the adoption of indeterminism or uncertainty. You've all heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says, you know, things at some level are random or unknowable. And he's saying this is in part the fact that scientists and mathematicians in the 1920s were willing to accept this was their response to the type of situation which I think was described very well by the gentleman in the back row, an attitude in the society that science is out of control, that the scientists are arrogant, they think that they can know everything and we all have to go along with it. That was exactly the type of attitude which had developed in the early 20th century of antagonism towards science being seen as an arrogant force in society that was perhaps doing bad things. And so in response to this, the scientists gave up the idea of determinism, the idea going back to the early 19th century that the laws of mechanics would completely determine what's going to happen for all of eternity, and saying that there is a certain amount of indeterminism, saying we don't know what's going on. So it was a sort of an attempt to take a modest position to counter this perception that scientists were thinking they knew everything. And that this was why, according to Forman, the scientists were willing to accept one of these basic principles of quantum mechanics, of Heisenberg's indeterminacy or uncertainty principle. Now, Forman argues that this was, therefore, the acceptance of this principle in quantum mechanics was a result of the social situation at a particular time and place, namely the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I. And as a historian, he actually has some good evidence for this. And I think this is where Forman is different from a lot of the social constructionists who cite Forman as an example of social construction, because Forman actually went out and read all of this stuff and was able to find what looks like evidence for this sort of thing. And one of the problems that I have with social constructionism is the lack of evidence, or the lack of even interest in finding evidence for the thesis. Okay, now the next person who is a leader of the social constructionist movement is David Bloor in Edinburgh. He called the strong program. Good rhetorical term to say my program is strong. And here he points out that when sociologists have looked at science, they have often been interested in cases where scientists have, for some reason, gotten what now seems to be the wrong answer. Okay, why does a scientist make a mistake, go off on the wrong trail? And they try to find, perhaps, a sociological or psychological reason to explain that. But if the scientist gets the right answer, then they don't think there's any need to explain it other than just that's the way nature is. The person has discovered the truth. Okay, so Bloor says this is unsymmetrical. This is not the way that sociology should work. You should basically give the same type of sociological explanation for what a scientist does, regardless of whether the answer that they come up with is later found to be true or false. So that was his symmetry principle. The same causes should be used to explain both truth and error. And then he goes on to argue that all knowledge is socially constructed, The sociologist is not responsible for judging the truth or the falsity of this, but only by studying how the scientists arrive at their conclusion. Okay? So the sociologist is not going to tell you whether you're, what the facts about nature are. He's just going to say, how did you arrive at them? One of the most famous social constructionists was Bruno Latour, who was French, who was the leading author of this book called Laboratory Life, in which he says that scientists are confronted with a chaos of facts, of data, and so forth. They try to make some sense out of them, and he uses the example of Maxwell's demon. Now, how many people have heard of Maxwell's demon? Okay. Anyway, his argument is that what the scientist does is to behave like Maxwell's demon. Confronted with a lot of randomly moving molecules, Maxwell's demon sorts them out and creates order where there was no order before. That is, by letting the fast molecules go into one side, the slow molecules go into another side. So that is the metaphor that he uses for how scientists in general construct knowledge about the world. And if you are familiar with Maxwell's demon, you can judge for yourself whether you think that's an adequate metaphor for what scientists do. Now, there's an interesting principle which Latour states. He first states it in a rather complicated way. Since the settlement of a controversy, meaning the agreement that such and such is the fact about nature, is the cause of nature's representation, that is, nature's representation, what we think is true about the world, not the consequence, we can never use the outcome, nature, to explain how and why a controversy has been settled. Now, what he means is, ordinarily, you would say a scientist believes something about the world because it's true. Latour says we should turn that around and say something is true because scientists believe it. Okay? So that is, you might say, one of the basic axioms of social construction is that there is no such thing as objective truth about the world apart from scientific research about it. What becomes the truth is what the scientists accept at a particular place in time. Yes, question?
I've heard ideas similar to this expressed, but I've also heard the qualification applied to it that although there's a certain amount of social construction or arbitrariness or whatsoever about this, it isn't as if anything goes. That is, there are constraints, and there may be, like, for instance, several solutions to the problem, but not an infinite number of arbitrary solutions to the problem.
Right.
Could you maybe elaborate on it? It's not a
Yeah.
completely subjective
Okay, I
fantasy.
think this is...
review helps a great deal.
Yeah. Okay, I think that this is what many of the social constructionists eventually came to accept. And Pickering, whom I'll talk about in a minute, is one of them. I think that what you're saying is certainly correct, that there could be some degree of social constructionism in how it comes out that the scientists put this in the textbook, but nevertheless they can't just completely make it up. I think so that's one of the problems with trying to understand this whole controversy is because social constructionists tend to make very extreme statements like this. And then when somebody like you comes along and says, well, sure, you can't violate the obvious fact that such and such, then they will back off, and then they will say, well, this is just a methodological principle. I will describe this as if this was the way. So that's one of the things that makes it a sort of a slippery theory, because the people who make the extreme statements won't stand up to criticism, but they will try to qualify them in the way that you have indicated.
Doesn't that sound like the Red Queen and Alice?
Yes. Yes. Right. Yes. Okay. So now, one of the other things that I find strange about social constructionists is that they consider themselves sympathetic to science, and they always act very offended when somebody accuses them of being anti-science. And in this book, they write, people think, somebody thinks that we are trying to cast doubt on the credibility of science by this social constructionist approach, but we didn't intend to do that. We are not intending to attack scientific activity. Okay, that's the, just disclaimer there. But then elsewhere, in another publication, Latour says he wants to strip science of its extravagant claim to authority, and they do want to attack the hegemony of sciences. Again, as the gentleman in the back row saying, this is what they are motivated by, is they think science has too much power, and they're trying to, reveal the roots of science as not being an objective study of nature, but something else. Now, here is a very frequently quoted statement, the one I put in black type here. Andrew Pickering has written this 25 years ago, has written this very interesting book about the history of some particular aspect of particle theory, the construction of the quark, the idea of the quark as a constituent of elementary particles. This is a book which is actually quite good and is good historical scholarship. As long as you don't read the first and the last chapters, you never would realize it was by a social constructionist. However, he states toward the end of the book that we don't really have to believe that what the scientists have found out about elementary particles is objectively true. Anybody, he says, who is trying to frame a view of the world can completely ignore whatever 20th century science has to say, because in effect it's all socially constructed. It doesn't reflect the objective reality. And the justification for that is simply that, well, the scientists themselves rejected the previous worldview, so therefore we might as well reject theirs as not being correct. Okay, now here is another...
Couldn't that be a softer interpretation, such, sir, that, there are still quandaries in particle physics, quark theory,
Right.
and the discussion of string theory,
Right.
and the unprovability of string
Right.
theories,
Right.
because it's very theoretical.
Right.
Going back to Kuhn,
Yes.
this exaggeration of his paradigmatic
Right.
views of a
Right.
new gestalt. A theory is a model,
Right.
and the data, if it fits the model, the theory then better explains, it can predict the future, if you will.
Well, I think...
I don't know much about Firebrand and these social constructivists, but do they take issue with the methods of science? The examples of the abuses of science well...
Okay, they take issue with the claim that scientists make that they're discovering objective truths about the world that were all there all the time before the scientists came along. The word discover means, uncover. There is something, there's a rock, you pick it up and you see, you have discovered, uncovered something which was there all the time. And the social constructionist is saying, in principle, that's not the way it works. There was not, this is what Pickering, I think, is saying, there was not any objective fact that was there to be discovered. That whatever facts there are, you have arrived at by your research and your discussion with your colleagues, arguing back and forth, and you've arrived at some conclusion which represents the consensus of the scientific community at that particular time. But it doesn't mean that you have found eternal truth, because your view now is equally likely to be overturned by somebody else 10, 20 years ago. I think that's what he's trying to say. But he says the problem is with many of these people, they like to make very shocking, extreme statements to get attention. And then when somebody calls them on it, they start backing up.
Like James Watson?
Yes. We have many good examples of that phenomenon. Okay. Now here is Steve Fuller, who is another interesting character. He's a postmodernist, I would say, but he's not a social constructionist in the traditional sense. I think he really wants to put more of a political spin on it, as Feyerabend did. And he says that the people who now call themselves social constructionists are not political enough. They're not really trying to reform society by their work, which Fuller thinks should be done. And so he wants to have people who are trained in science studies, science, technology, society, to move into science policy positions in NSF or administration and so forth, and promote this more democratic view of science, being responsive to the public. And in particular, he is perfectly happy with giving equal time to creationism in public school science courses, has compiled a workbook methodology for that purpose. And he was one of the very few people who testified at the Dover trial. You remember the trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, about using intelligent design. If you watch that program, they had a program about that on PBS last year. Steve Fuller shows up in that video, and he was one of the very few respectable people who actually testify in favor of the intelligent design side. And I think basically for the same reason that I've been talking about, that if you are a postmodernist, you think all views are perfectly equally valid, and therefore the evolutionists should not have a monopoly. Okay, finally, this is for to find out how do people regard social constructionism if they are doing it. And one of the things that I have found annoying is that they make statements that such and such is socially constructed without really trying to give any evidence for that. And here we have somebody who is not otherwise well known, but I found this one statement, and she was educated in a science studies program at Cornell where this was what was being taught. It is not a hypothesis to be tried and tested on historical subjects and presumably abandoned if found lacking. It's a way of looking at the world. And I think that's an accurate statement, but I think you have to get through some of the jargon to realize that no attempt is being made to justify that view of the world. Simply, let's look at the world that way, even though we can't prove that is accurate. Now, I think that the social construction movement has many virtues, which I think have to be, for the sake of fairness, has to be stated up front. First of all, in the history of science, we talk about things like the Whig interpretation, which means looking at the past from the point of view of the present, finding out who were the good guys, who was on the right side of the controversy, who was on the wrong side, judging past science by what we now believe to be the case. That's known as the Whig interpretation. And I think the social constructionists have done a lot to get away from that and to really study the past on its own terms, to look at the documents. Some very good history has come out of this. Also, the emphasis on the laboratory. Historians of science and scientists have tended to look at the past in terms of theory. They have not paid as much attention as they should to what goes on in the laboratory, which is where, according to Latour and others, the facts are constructed. Also, when I first heard about this whole movement of social construction, I thought, gee, that's an interesting idea. I wonder where, how they do this, how do they get evidence for it? And in looking into this, I found that there were, in fact, some valid examples that were, to me, valid examples of social construction of facts that are now regarded as valid in science. The only problem was these are not the facts that the social constructionists themselves were interested in. For example, if you look at the history of the IQ and of the various statements that have been made and accepted about sex differences and race differences and IQ, I think that's a very good example of social construction. The IQ itself is not something which is out there. It's something which is constructed by the psychologists. And if you look at the original work of Lewis Terman at Stanford, who's got the whole IQ test started in the United States, you find that when he first gave his test to tests that he had taken over from Binet in France to 1,000 school children in California, this is the beginning of the 20th century, he found that actually with the items that he had put on the test, the girls did better than the boys by a few points. Well, that of course was not acceptable because everybody knew at the time that men are smarter than women, after all the great scientists and so forth. So therefore, the test had to be adjusted. And of course, this was fairly easy to do because there were some items where the girls did better and other items where the boys did better. So all you had to do was balance them out so you get a test which gives you exactly the same average IQ for both sexes, and that's what we have now. Now, a lot of people say, isn't it remarkable that boys and girls have the same average IQ? Well, it's not remarkable at all because that was constructed that way. On the other hand, when other people found that blacks, this is during World War I, blacks had lower IQs by that test, that was perfectly acceptable socially. Everybody, accepted that result. Nobody of any importance that I could find ever tried to redesign an IQ test which would be defined in such a way that blacks and whites would have the same intelligence. So here I think is a very good example of how the views, the social views that people have about sex differences and race differences have fed into and had a big influence on the IQ test and then by extension the SAT, which is used for college admissions. Anyway, I think that's the sort of thing where you could argue there is a social construction, but which the people that I'm talking about don't seem to be interested in. Another example is that this whole idea of the relation between reality and what you observe or construct that is being promoted is actually rather similar to what is said about quantum mechanics. And how many people have some idea of what the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is? Okay, good, few people. Okay. Copenhagen interpretation says the only thing that's real is what you measure. You can't claim that there's an underlying reality. And the example which is given, and this I heard this in a lecture by John Wheeler, a physicist several years ago, is let's suppose the situation in baseball where you have an umpire who looks at the pitch, and if the batter doesn't swing, the umpire has to call the pitch as either a ball or a strike. Okay? It becomes a ball or a strike only when the umpire calls it as such, right? You can't say it was anything until the umpire called it. By the rules of the game, it's the judgment of the umpire making this decision, okay? It determines, it's the observation of the umpire that determines whether it's a ball or a strike. So in a sense, reality is not there before you observe it. It only becomes real as part of an observation that you make. Now, when we're having the social construction discussion later on that I'll talk about, a social constructionist postmodernist, I think his name is Stanley Fish, some of you may have heard the name, used exactly the same metaphor to show the social construction was valid. And it was that so it's interesting that that quantum mechanics and social constructions share this view of reality. Yes?
Could you sanity check my understanding that the Copenhagen interpretation was not an appeal to mysticism? But
It's not what?
It was not an appeal to mysticism, but was an acknowledgement of the practicalities of the domain that they were studying. One could not know in theory or in experiment any more than what one had learned from measuring. And certain shorthands of phrasing said there is no reality. What it means is there's no reality we can verify. We have no way of verifying any underlying reality beyond the schema that we have chosen and their measurement dominates. And this is quite different than the metaphor of construction. Okay, that's a rhetorical question. Is that a fair way of razoring between?
I think it is fair to make a distinction, yes. I think part of it is the confusion of the rhetoric of people who make these statements. Because people like Heisenberg say, well, what about the reality of where the electron really is? And he says it doesn't make any sense to talk about reality of something that you, in principle, cannot determine. So people who accept the Copenhagen reputation often make exactly that type of dogmatic statement, that reality does not exist until it's observed, okay? So in both cases, I think you have extreme statements being made, which tend to polarize the situation. Okay, the final example, well, no, I have to mention this. Latour has been ridiculed for saying, somebody said, well, such and such historical figure had tuberculosis, Ramsey or somebody. And Latour said, impossible. Tuberculosis as a disease did not exist until the 19th century when a scientist studied it and constructed it as a disease. But before that, there was no such thing as tuberculosis. So anyway, this is an example of you know, going too far, I think.
Wasn't he just making a point, though?
He's always making a point. Yes.
He didn't actually believe that it didn't exist.
Well, you see, that's the thing. Many of these statements are people making a point, but in fact, when you take their statement literally, then they back off and say, well, I didn't really mean that. So,
A lot of dodging and weaving.
now there's a very, what the other thing is, I found it very amusing to read some of these papers. They write, I think sociologists have the reputation of writing very turgid prose. These guys are very good writers, especially Latour. And there's a paper that he writes on the sociology of the door closer. In other words, something which, when you try to get out that door, the door will close, or you don't want it to. And he has a really very funny article about the sociology of the door closer as an agent that you have to take account. I think I have a question over here.
Yeah, you seem to be accusing the door of kind of playing fast and loose with whether or not, say, tuberculosis actually existed. Are you saying that he actually was making the claim that it didn't exist and that he later sort of backed off on that?
I don't know that he ever backed off on it. I know
Okay.
it's something that became a notorious statement that he had made. Yeah.
Existed in a kind of ontological sense. Now, it seems to me that the point he's making a point about what we call tuberculosis and scientific labels, things like that, not whether the disease as such existed. And so the criticism that you're making would seem to have force only if he actually came out and said that the disease as such didn't exist.
Well, I think that's based on the quotation that I read you before, which let me show you again. I think that's a reasonable inference from.
It's like today's epidemic of erectile dysfunction. It didn't exist 10 years ago.
Okay. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of this statement right here, that the settlement of a controversy is the cause of nature's representation. Now that's a rather opaque statement. What he seems to mean is the scientists argued, that's the controversy, and they settled it, and they agreed. That's the fact, okay? But you can't say they agreed to accept it because it was true. All you can say is it becomes true because they accept it. And he says that in various different ways throughout his writings, that you can't say something that scientists believe a statement because it's true. You can only say it's true because they believe it. And I think that's a consistent position that he has taken throughout his writings. Yes?
Well, yeah, but then you're kind of, and I don't know, maybe you was claiming something that radical. It's like saying, well, Neptune didn't exist prior to, 1789 or something like that.
Right. I'm sure he would say that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, people can make a statement like that to sort of like emphasize how our social construction, how
I mean, we are now in the process of deconstructing the existence of Pluto as a planet.
Yeah.
It used to be Pluto was a planet. Everybody accepted that as a fact about the world. Now, as a result of something, it no longer is a real planet. It's something else.
Yeah.
I think that people are giving him too much benefit of the doubt. I mean, if he wanted to modify it that way, he would have easily have stated that.
These guys don't go in for modifications. They like to make bold, radical statements.
And I think I don't see any other way of interpreting that other than there was no such thing as tuberculosis in ancient
Okay, I'll have to ask you to read what he said. I think the book is called The Pasteurization of France or something like that. But I think everybody who is interested in this should really read the book and see what you think he meant. But that's one of the problems, in fact, of understanding social construction, is that it's not clear what you mean by it, because people mean different things, and they'll say one thing at one time, which sounds very clear, and then somebody attacks them and they'll draw back and qualify it. Yes?
We're essentially engaged in gibberish. Something existed prior to figuring out that it was a disease called tuberculosis. I mean, there are diseases recorded in history. That's science, like the disease that racked Athens in the time of Pericles, or just what was the Black Death? People were dying of it by the millions, and so they were dying of something. And Pluto was out there. I mean, it's a ball of ice is floating around out there, whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
Another view, which I don't know if it has anything to do with the social constructionism, but it's an extreme form of nominalism, advocated I think by Goodman, which is that there are multiple realities. There isn't just one, but there are multiple realities corresponding to domains of description or whatever that you are able to. And apparently he really believes that there are separate multiple realities, which may or may not have existed in the past. I don't know.
I don't think Latour thinks like a philosopher, but I think he's very good at what he does, which is making something sound interesting and striking and revolutionary and radical that will, make you protest, say that you can't possibly believe that. Okay, let's pass on to what I consider to be the faults, the disadvantages of social constructionism. One is the fact that it's not a stable thing. If you attack somebody, makes a statement, they will try to qualify it or make in some way retreat from it. Secondly is the fact that I think there's a lack of evidence. People do, the social constructionists don't seem to see any need for backing up their claim that something is socially constructed with any evidence. And when they are called upon to do this, one of the things they do is they say, well, all right, here's an example. They will say, here we have two scientists given the same data, and they come to different conclusions about what is the truth. Well, if they have the same data, then they must be influenced by social factors. One of them, has a different social factor to react to than the other. Now, this I think is a logical fallacy, because there could be all kinds of other reasons why two scientists confronted with the same facts come to different conclusions. So this is sort of like the argument the creationists use. They seem to think if you can refute evolution, then you have to accept creationism as if there's no other choice. So that's the type of problem that I have there. Okay, there is the claim that all science is local. All of this social construction goes on in a particular laboratory at a particular time and place. Well, how would you then explain the fact, the phenomenon that many people have noted of simultaneous discovery? That two people in different continents, having perhaps no contact with each other, will at almost the same time come up with exactly the same discovery. That seems to be some evidence that what they're discovering is real, because whatever social factors there might have been are going to be completely different for those people. I don't see that the social constructionists have, really any reply to that particular objection that I have seen. Yes.
If my memory serves me correctly, two people came up back in around 1886 or so. Two people came up with a way of purifying aluminum around simultaneously. I think they call it the Hall-Héroult process because they met the two people. How would Latour explain that one?
I don't think he tries to. I don't think he even discusses anything like that. That's my objection. Is that he and the others ignore the whole phenomenon of simultaneous discovery because it would be difficult for them to explain if the discovery occurred in different cultures with different social factors. It seems to be evidence against social construction. That would be my view.
You don't have to read too many of their works to realize that they don't have a very deep knowledge of most science anyway. They would that example would never occur to them because they would never know about it.
Right. Yeah.
Feyerabend, I remember, was particularly savaged for a claim that one of the drawings in the Starry Messenger was made up by Galileo. You couldn't possibly observe the moon that way. And I remember the astronomer sent in a photograph of the moon that exactly matches the drawing. And I think that was a kind of a fair measure of Feyerabend's actual level of scholarship.
That's happened in other people writing about Galileo, claiming he couldn't have done this experiment because he wouldn't have gotten this answer, and then somebody else actually does it and gets the same answer.
If I might jump in, Galileo and Neptune being mentioned brings to mind something interesting. Galileo is the first human being to observe the planet Neptune back in, I believe, 1610 or something like that, but he didn't realize that it wasn't a background star, and he merely noted it on a star chart near the planet Jupiter. Interesting. How do you interpret that this planet existed? A human being observed it, he didn't realize it was a planet.
That's right, and Latour would say it didn't exist until 1846 as a planet Neptune.
Yes.
It was just a light, a smudge of light in somebody's telescope field, but you couldn't say that's Neptune. It didn't become Neptune until it was officially discovered, and people then agreed, yes, this is an actual planet. So that would be, that would be an example. Okay. I think I mentioned this already. The argument that social constructionists make, they don't understand why are we called anti-science. Well, it seems to me that as people who are supposedly expert in human behavior and sociology and psychology, they should realize that if you tell a scientist that what you are doing is not discovering truth about the world, but just making it up, surely that's an insult to the scientists. And it's, in a sense, if anybody believes it, it's a threat to their funding, and it's going to be a threat to their motivation. So I am always surprised that the social constructionists are surprised when scientists say, you guys are anti-science. Okay. I think it shows a tremendous amount of naivete about human nature to not realize that people will see what you're doing as an attack on science. Okay, now, the last example here is one that the social constructionists have admitted themselves, or one of them is, namely, is smoking bad for you? Now, I think what happened was that for many years, the tobacco companies concealed the evidence that they had that nicotine is addictive, et cetera, and it was only within the last decade or so that they were forced to open up their documents and subjected to lawsuits and so forth, and it was established that smoking is bad for you, okay? Now, if you are a social constructionist, this guy, Ashmore, a very appropriate name, I think, is saying, this is one of the problems we social constructionists, he's putting himself in this group, have to face, is that often we find ourselves politically on the wrong side of a controversy. And in particular, we would have, if we believed in social constructionism, we would have to support the tobacco companies if they're sued in court, who claim that they didn't, smoking is not bad for you until it has been accepted by the scientific community that it is bad for you. Then it has been constructed to be bad. And Ashmore says, well, if we really took that seriously, we would be in that rather embarrassing position of having to defend the tobacco companies. Okay. So now, a philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, who I think, tell me how much more time I have.
Well, we have to leave the room at 4, and the questions and answers have been coming.
Yeah.
So as long as you mutually agree, have a social construction.
Okay, fine.
Let's provide some
We can't do what the legislature in Annapolis does, set the clock back to...
Yeah. Tell them around 3:30 we start, guilt should arrive.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, Ian Hacking is a very good philosopher of science who has a good grasp of history. He wrote a book on the social construction of what, and what he tried to, as a philosopher, sort out what was going on here, and basically came to the conclusion that people who use social construction ideas really want to criticize or change the thing that they claim to be socially constructed. So it really is, from his point of view, quite obvious that social constructionists are anti-science. Now, the third part of my talk is how did this whole thing collapse? Because I think it has in fact collapsed. And one of the interesting things is that all of the founders and heroes of this movement at some point rejected it and went on to other things. Kuhn was the most obvious because he claimed that his own views had been grossly misinterpreted and that the sociologists, when he was talking about, you know, you have to have a community get together and decide whether to accept the new paradigm, the sociologists said this is social construction. But Kuhn says, I was just talking about what scientists do all the time. They talk to each other. The people who are experts on the subject evaluate the evidence, and they decide, you know, the top guys who are most respected decide which theory to accept, and then the rest of the community probably follows them. But that doesn't mean that social factors in the community of, you know, among non-scientists have anything to do with that decision. So he felt that his view had been completely misrepresented. And he says in the social studies, now this is very interesting, he gets an award. See, that he's regarded as a great hero of the social construction movement. Society for Social Studies of Science is the principal organ of the social constructionists, okay? And it's a, the society gives an award to Kuhn because he's their hero. So he comes to accept the award and immediately starts denouncing them. And says, I reject the whole idea that your society is based on. Because you talk about interests, you talk about, you know, interests affect knowledge, the growth of knowledge, but you're only talking about one kind of interest. You're talking about social economic interest, and I'm talking about cognitive, intellectual, scientific interests. And of course those things accept the growth of knowledge. So anyway, he says, you have completely misinterpreted me. Then we have, a few years later, he gives a lecture at Harvard in which he says, the most extreme form of the movement, this is the strong program of David Bloor, has been understood as claiming that power and interest are all there are. Whoever has the most power can impose their view of science on everybody else. Okay, and nature itself has no part in the development of beliefs about it. He's saying that is the view of the social constructionists, that the scientists think, the constructionists think that scientists make up these things without really giving any role to the real world. And he says this is ridiculous, and this is an example of deconstruction gone mad. So he very strongly rejects the whole principle of social construction. Now, Latour publishes a second edition of his classic work, the social, you know, the laboratory life, the social construction of scientific facts, and very pointedly omits the word social from the title of the second edition, and then explains why. And basically what it means is that he is rejecting social constructionism. Even as one of the primary heroes and practitioners of it, Latour himself says it's nonsense because, among other things, it gives primacy to social factors over nature. And he wants to replace this with what he calls the actor network theory, in which everybody is equal. This is sort of taking Bloor's idea to an ultimate extreme. That everything is a network of scientists and nature and animals and plants and door closers and animate objects. Everything is an actor. You have to see how they're all tied together. Social constructionism is completely unsymmetrical because it says somehow social forces are more important than anything else, which is ridiculous, he says. Okay, you can't say society is more real than nature. David Bloor, in 1997, publishes a paper called, remember the Strong Program? I mean, the title says it all. Obviously, he realizes nobody does remember it except himself, and it was by 1997, the whole thing has been forgotten. And so he tries to explain why he thinks it's been forgotten, but he's very clearly admitting the whole movement has sort of flopped. But then he makes a very interesting statement. Stephen Cole, who is a sociologist of science of the old school, not say the Burton school that came before social construction, has challenged the social constructionists to give just one example of a fact that is accepted as part of the core of scientific knowledge that has been socially constructed. Just show me one example where, using the traditional methods that sociologists have to sort out cause and effect and so forth. Show me one fact that is really, you can prove is socially constructed. Okay, so Bloor says, well, here's an example. This fellow Andrew Warwick, who's a good historian of physics, has studied the reception of relativity at Cambridge University and found that there were two groups, theorists and experimentalists, who seem to mean different things by relativity theory. So there's an example. You belong to one social group, you think it means one thing, another group, you think it means something else. Problem is, if you actually read Warwick's paper, you see he only goes up to 1911. And relativity is by no means in the core of scientific knowledge at this time. This is a frontier subject. And Cole has perfectly clearly stated that social factors can certainly affect people's views when it's on the frontiers of science and the issue hasn't been settled yet. It's only when it's been settled and we now write textbooks and we have an established core, that's when the question of social construction rises. So basically, Bloor took a very bad example, I think, because he didn't know anything about relativity or its history. And so the one example that he could think of is not an example of social construction, because relativity in 1911 was not part of the core of scientific knowledge. Okay, Harry Collins is another social constructionist who says that okay, anyway, Collins was somebody who would talk about relativism and says that relativism is the way to do social studies of science. And he claims that social construction has been successful, and now we can move on to something else. And so he proposes a new version, what he calls the third wave of science studies, which will be the study of expertise. He's very interested in the study of gravity waves, and in fact spent some time at the University of Maryland interviewing Joe Weber, who claimed to have discovered gravity waves, and wrote a huge book about the subject. Actually, some very interesting history there, but he was interested in the social reasons why Weber's claims to have discovered gravity were not accepted by other physicists. So now Collins wants us to believe that one, as a sociologist, one can be an expert, one can have expertise on a subject like the theory of gravity waves without being able to do the math, without understanding math beyond high school algebra level, which he confesses is his own situation. Somehow by talking to people you can find out and you can be an expert on gravity waves without really understanding the math.
Would you also say that experts in gravity waves can understand sociology, become experts there?
Well, that's an interesting question. When I was spending a year at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Study, it was just after they had gone through a mini scandal where they had tried, the social scientists in the Institute had tried to appoint Bruno Latour to a professorship which was available in the social sciences. This appointment was vetoed by the mathematicians, okay? And so just a year or two ago, I was sitting at the lunch table with one of these mathematicians, and I said, how is it that you mathematicians feel that you are qualified to judge the qualifications of a sociologist? And does this work both ways? If you guys want to appoint somebody in math, would you let the sociologists who are in the institute veto it? And he said, oh yes, of course, if the sociologists are willing to learn enough math to be qualified to make that judgment. But anyway, I think the answer to your question is that scientists would think themselves qualified to reject somebody's appointment in a field like sociology on the basis of what they had said about science in this case. It's not symmetrical.
Doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah.
Dr. Brush, I would ask you to wrap up any points you want to make, because I was just apprised that we actually have to be vacant from this. We have to vacate the room at 10 minutes of 4 because of the security schedule. And we want to just have some time for people to talk with you one-on-one with each other. So maybe in the next 5 minutes we could do that.
Okay. Now, I think the thing which is most interesting about this is that how it ended. As I say, I think the whole movement was collapsing, according to Latour and other people, in the early 1990s. But what put the final nail on the coffin was what is called the SoCal hoax. How many of you remember the SoCal hoax? Okay. Alan Sokal, who is a physicist, submitted an article to a journal called Social Text, in which this turned out that they were preparing an article on what they called the Science Wars, which was the battle between the social constructionists on the one hand and the scientists on the other. And people like Gross and Levitt had been very vociferous in attacking the social constructionists, a book called Higher Superstition. And so Sokal studied up on this subject and wrote an article which he submitted to this journal, in which he basically pretended to be a postmodernist in a very convincing way. And he wrote this article using all of the proper jargon and giving quotations from Derrida and all these other guys about their statements about science, which clearly indicated they didn't know anything about science, and made up several statements that would have been an immediate tip-off to anybody who knew anything about math or physics, such as this statement here about the infinite dimensional invariance group, blah, blah, blah. The pi of Euclid, formerly thought to be constant and universal, are now perceived in their ineluctable historicity. Now, I would submit that anybody who knows anything about math would realize that was a spoof. That he was telling you that pi would evolve historically. Well, what happened was that he got this published in the issue of the Social Text Journal that was called Science Wars. And the editors of this journal never bothered to submit this article for refereeing to anybody who knew anything about science. And they obviously knew nothing about science themselves, otherwise they would have spotted this as a fake. So it got published, and immediately at the same time, Sokal had arranged to reveal the spoof, what I would call a sting maybe, in a journal called Lingua Franca. And it appeared the whole thing appeared on the front page of the New York Times. And so immediately, everybody in the world who was interested in this immediately was shown that the social constructionists in fact knew nothing about science, at least the people who were in charge of editing this magazine, and that somebody could easily fool them into thinking this was a treatise on the social construction of science, when in fact it was just a parody on it. And I would compare this with, if you are familiar with the career of Stephen Colbert, well, you remember that Stephen Colbert plays a right-wing fundamentalist on his program at 11:30 on the Comedy Channel. He does a very good job of pretending to be a right-wing nut, and so good that apparently somebody who was organizing the White House Correspondents' Dinner invited him to give this after-dinner speech at this meeting in which President Bush was sitting in front. Well, assuming whoever invited him obviously must have thought he really wasn't. And so instead, he lashed into Bush and emphasized how unpopular he was and all the mistakes he made and so forth. And everybody was sort of shocked, and Bush was sitting there in the front row. Anyway, you can read this speech if you're interested. Stephen, if you go into the bookstore, you'll see this book that he just published, I Am America, is in the, still in the bestseller list. So
Even better, you can see it on the web.
you can see it on the web, you can see it in the bookstore, anywhere. Anyway, it's very amusing. So basically, I consider Stephen Colbert's speech to the White House press correspondents as being the equivalent in politics of what Alan Sokal was doing in the fight in the science wars, to expose the social constructionists as people who basically didn't know enough science to even have anything to say on the subject. So I better stop there.
Thank you, sir.